Will Freedom Die with Capitalism? Orwell's article was written in response to a letter from Douglas Eade of Withersfield, Suffolk, to the editor of The Left News. Dear Sir, your paper being of a virile nature, you surely will not mind answering a single question on your policy by one who is by no means unsympathetic to you. Many of your readers must also be as perplexed on this point as myself, and would welcome enlightenment. Do you really intend to build a socialistic democracy, as George Orwell stated in his article on your January number? If so, will you please tell us more clearly how you are going to do it? I have read very carefully the ILP statement of policy, but fail to see that the democratic way would achieve the 13 points set out. 1. Would you not arrive by following these points at something very little different to a communist state? Even accepting point 10, b. the workers' committees which anyhow exist in Russia, where would the democracy come in? 2. Assuming that you conscript private wealth, and yet found a system which is not communist and not fascist, what guarantee can you give us that the system resulting will not have totalitarian evils rather than democratic advantages? 3. I do not mind handing over my personal wealth to the state, if I can be sure the state will give me something in return. Like the totalitarian states, you want to control my wealth. Unlike the totalitarian states, you promise me democracy in return. 4. We all find democracy a very much harder thing to define than totalitarianism, and Mr. Strachey would have done us a greater service by writing on the former than by writing on the latter. If Mr. Orwell can prove that his democracy can exist, shorn of the evils of capitalism, I, for one, should be glad. 5. Are we to be gulled, like the Germans were on Hitler's advent to power, by words such as socialism, national democratic, or otherwise? Are not the main issues still between totalitarianism and capitalist democracy? Under the words socialism or any other kind of democracy, is it not likely that a system as bad or worse than capitalistic democracy will be evolved? 6. I am sure many of your readers are like me and feel that good intentions are not enough. Maybe your policy is an alternate democracy to capitalist democracy, and yet not communistic or fascist. If so, you had better define it more clearly, as you have not defined it nearly enough. If there is such an alternate system to these other two, it is clearly the system which the world is waiting for. Therefore, I can think of no better propaganda for your cause than if you made this system absolutely clear. The evils of capitalistic democracy we already know, and even your able articles on communism and totalitarianism are fairly common knowledge. But this new utopia you advocate, tell us more of that. Even if you cannot publish a reply, perhaps to insert my letter in a future number might bring forth interesting comments and ideas from your readers. I am, sir, very faithfully yours, Douglas Eade. This letter is a criticism of socialism from what may be called the liberal angle. I think its general drift can be summarized in two questions. 1. Is there any reason to think that socialism will be genuinely preferable to capitalist democracy? 2. Can democracy, as we know it, survive into a collectivist age, or is it simply a reflection of laissez-faire capitalism? Obviously, the two questions overlap, but the first of them raises wider issues and touches upon the all-important doctrine of historic necessity. One can perhaps get a clearer view of the second question if one deals with the first separately. It is not claimed by socialists that the changeover to a collectivist economy will make human life happier, easier, or even freer immediately. On the contrary, the transition may make life very nearly unbearable for a long period, perhaps for hundreds of years. There is a certain goal that we have got to reach, cannot help reaching, ultimately, and the way to it may lead through some dreadful places. What socialists of, I should say, nearly all schools believe is that the destiny and therefore the true happiness of man lies in a society of pure communism, that is to say, a society in which all human beings are more or less equal, in which no one has the power to oppress another, in which economic motives have ceased to operate, in which men are governed by love and curiosity and not by greed and fear. That is our destiny, and there is no escaping it. But how we reach it, and how soon, depends on ourselves. Socialism, centralized ownership of the means of production, plus political democracy, is the necessary next step towards communism, just as capitalism was the next necessary step after feudalism. It is not in itself the final objective, and I think we ought to guard against assuming that as a system to live under, it will be greatly preferable to democratic capitalism. If we look backward, we can see that innovations without which further progress would have been impossible were not always improvements in themselves. If one is thinking simply of the quality of human life, I do not believe that Western society, during recorded time, has made any real advantage except in the adoption of Christianity. The medieval village was almost certainly better than the Roman slave farm. But the next step was probably a falling off. Feudalism had to break up. Capitalism had to replace it. Because without the concentration of capital, the technical discoveries that would lead to a further advance could not have been made. But as a way of life, capitalism was not better than feudalism. It was far worse. Feudal society may be unjust, but it is human. Love and loyalty can exist in it, though equality cannot. Capitalism, as such, has no room in it for any human relationship. It has no law except that profits must always be made. Not much more than a century ago, children as young as 6 were brought up and worked to death in the mines and cotton mills, more ruthlessly than we should now work a donkey. This was not more cruel than the Spanish Inquisition, but it was more inhuman, in that the men who worked those children to death thought of them as mere units of labor, things, whereas the Spanish Inquisitor would have thought of them as souls. According to the capitalist ethic, there is absolutely nothing wrong in turning a man out to starve after he has served you for 40 years. On the contrary, it may be sound business, a necessary retrenchment which is part of your duty to your shareholders. It is true that capitalism has been tamed and modified and has developed certain virtues of its own. I will return to this in a moment. But I think it must be admitted that it is inherently evil, and that, as a result of it, human life has deteriorated in certain ways. The decadence of our language, the hideous vulgarity of our clothes, the badness of our manners, the disappearance of popular art, are symptoms of this deterioration. And there is not much doubt that primitive peoples, untouched by capitalism and industrialism, are happier than civilized men. Almost anyone who has traveled will confirm this. Among primitive peoples, at any rate in warm climates, the faces that you see are predominantly happy. In no great city of the West is this true. But it is impossible to remain permanently at the same stage of development. No one, even if he possessed the historical foresight that this would imply, is able to say, "We have now reached a desirable way of life and we refuse to advance any further." Technical progress always continues, even when, for the time being, it degrades human personality. The new civilization always wipes out the old, if only because it is more efficient militarily. It is inevitable that the planned, centralized state should supersede laissez-faire capitalism, because the latter is as helpless against it in a serious struggle as the Abyssinians were against the Italian machine guns. We have seen this demonstrated beyond question during the past 2 years. As against the planned economy of Nazi Germany, Britain and France were simply unable to arm. The concentration on a single object, the overriding of private interests, the lowering of the standard of living which are necessary when a modern nation goes seriously to war, were not possible without a social and economic reconstruction which their rulers would not face. As a result, France went down like a house of cards, and Britain only escaped because of geographical advantages. The possession of a navy that was semi-autonomous and had, therefore, been able to keep itself up to a reasonable strength, and the stolidity of the national character. Since then, every move towards military efficiency has been a move away from old-fashioned capitalism. If one takes the moral as well as the physical side of the war into account, it seems probable that Britain can only win by becoming, more definitely and unmistakably than Nazi Germany, a socialist state. But, at any rate, it is certain that unless the war ends in some unpredictable way within the next few months, Britain will not emerge in the shape it had under Chamberlain. It may emerge socialist, or Nazified by conquest, or with some local variant of fascism, but it will not emerge capitalist in the old sense of the word. The forces making for centralized control and planned production and consumption are overwhelming. It is the way the world is going. War merely clarifies the issue, and those who try to check the progress usually end by accelerating it. Men like Mussolini and Franco, who start off with the avowed and probably honest intention of restoring the past, safeguarding private property, and crushing Marxism, end by destroying the very rights they set out to defend. The capitalists call them in to enslave the working class, and find themselves enslaved in the process. The movement towards collectivism goes on all the time, though it takes varying forms, some hopeful, others horrible. But, it can be said, if collectivism is already triumphing everywhere, and pure communism is bound to arrive in the end, what is there to bother about? Why fight against Hitler, or our local equivalent of Hitler, since it will be all the same in 100 years? And this raises, by implication, the second of the two questions in which I tried to summarize Mr. Eads' letter. Unfortunately, it is not certain that it will all be the same in 100 years, or 1,000 years, or perhaps even 10,000 years, and therein lies the whole reason for struggle. I have said that what is happening everywhere is the replacement of competitive societies in which the individual has absolute rights over his own property by planned societies in which power is centralized. Till recently, it was assumed as a matter of course that this new form of society, when it arrived, would be socialism. Socialism was defined as common ownership of the means of production, and few people bothered themselves about the exact meaning of the word common. It was held that the only kind of injustice that mattered was economic injustice, and economic injustice must vanish with private property. Nazism, which neither formally abolished private property nor respected the rights of the individual, did not fit into this scheme of things, and, till very recently, it remained the official theory of the left that Nazism was just capitalism. Its centralizing tendency, the quite manifest subjugation of the capitalists by the party officials, were ignored, and the Nazi system was declared to be no more than a thinly veiled dictatorship of businessmen. Hitler was written off as the tool of the German heavy industrialists, the pawn of Thyssen. We have recently seen which of these two is the pawn, and the ideological side of the movement was dismissed as beneath notice. Since Nazism was not what any Western European meant by socialism, clearly it must be capitalism. While they reasoned thus, the official theorists of the left were never able to explain why Hitler came to power, why millions of men were willing to die for him, or how he won his victories. They were forced enormously to underrate the strength of Nazism. Otherwise, they would have had to admit that Nazism did avoid the contradictions of capitalism, that it was a kind of socialism, though a non-democratic kind. And that would have meant admitting that common ownership of the means of production is not a sufficient objective, that by merely altering the structure of society, you improve nothing. As against capitalist democracy, Nazism must prevail because it is more up-to-date, therefore more efficient militarily. But as a way of life, it is immensely worse. It is a step forward and a step to the bad. Nazism can be defined as oligarchical collectivism. It can avoid all the chaos and friction of capitalism, the slumps and crises, the unemployment and stagnation, and it can probably keep running for an indefinite length of time. But even less than capitalism does it make for human happiness or human equality. Its tendency is towards the setting up of a caste system based on racial superiority, but probably with an adoptive rather than hereditary caste at the top. It is a new form of tyranny, in which power and not money is the thing that counts. It seems fairly certain that something of the same kind is occurring in Soviet Russia. The similarity of the two regimes has been growing more and more obvious for the last 6 years. Just as at the end of the feudal age, there appeared a new figure, the man of money, so at the end of the capitalist age, there appears another new figure, the man of power, the Nazi Goleta or Bolshevik Commissar. Such men may be individually corrupt, but as a type, they are neither mercenary nor hedonistic. They don't want ease and luxury. They merely want the pleasure of tyrannizing over other people. And since power has not been debunked as money has, they can proceed with a self-righteousness and ignorance of their own motives that would be impossible to a mere money grubber. But from the point of view of the underdog, the rule of power is worse than the rule of money, because money is more subdivisible. But is there really no other alternative than dictatorship and plutocracy? The answer is that the world revolution is only just beginning. What one can call revolution has only happened in 2 great countries, in both of which military despotism was the normal form of society. Grant that the transition to a centralized economy must happen, is happening everywhere, and it is safe to assume that it will take different forms in different countries. There is no reason for thinking that the West will imitate the East. When people speak of the West, or Western civilization, they mean a ring of states fringing on the North Atlantic, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, France, Britain, and North America. These states have enough in common to be thought of as a single culture. All of them were infected by the ideas of the French Revolution. All of them have developed parliamentary democracies which were inefficient, but which did act as a check on political adventurers. And all of them have had a high enough standard of living to allow independent labor movements to develop. The two biggest of them have been saved by their maritime position from foreign invasion and the rule of armies. Most important of all, a belief in the value of bourgeois democracy is widespread in all these countries, and more among the common people than among their rulers. Freedom may be an illusion, but you could not, in England, induce large numbers of young men to march up and down proclaiming, "We spit upon freedom." And that fact is symptomatically important. The enemies of Western civilization are fond of pointing out that the comparative peacefulness and decency of life in the democracies are simply the reflection of a high national income, which, for 100 years past, has been based largely on colored labor. This is true, but it is rather like saying, "This field is only more fertile than that because it was manured last year." Our scruples are not less real because we have bought them with the blood of Indian coolies. A hatred of civil violence and a respect for freedom of speech are definite factors in Western life, and they are not likely to vanish overnight, even if our standard of living drops to that of Eastern Europe. Men's beliefs are not so crudely dependent on material circumstances as to alter from day to day, or even from year to year. A professor of science, wrecked on a desert island, may be reduced to the condition of a savage, but he does not become a savage. He does not start believing that the sun goes round the earth, for instance. When our revolution is accomplished, our social and economic structure will be totally different, but we shall retain many of the habits of thought and behavior that we learned in an earlier age. Nations do not easily wipe out their past. There is no question of saving capitalist democracy. It is disappearing. But that is not to say that one Monday morning we shall wake up to a world of slogans and rubber truncheons. I think the answer to Mr. Eads' query must be that if we can bring our revolution about, it will be, comparatively speaking, a bloodless one, and that many features of capitalist democracy, whose disappearance he rightly dreads, will be able to survive it. All depends on the if. We have to keep our destiny in our own hands, which implies waging the war on two fronts. I have said earlier that we shall emerge from this war either socialist, Nazified by conquest, or victorious with a brand of fascism peculiar to ourselves. And it is doubtful whether the third alternative practically exists. One striking thing about this war has been the failure of the British ruling class to develop a genuinely fascist outlook. In spite of a certain amount of will to do so, they seem not to possess either the intelligence, the political understanding, or the simple wickedness to learn totalitarian methods. Of course, England is still a class-ridden country, and the offensive contrast of wealth and poverty exists everywhere amid the bombs. But that is plutocracy, a very different thing from fascism. And of course, there is curtailment of the rights of labor, press censorship, political persecution of a petty kind, a general diminution of liberty. But that is war. One has to compare the behavior of the British government not with some impossible ideal, but with that of any government at war, whatever its color. The Spanish Republican government, for instance, from the very beginning of the Civil War, outraged every principle of democracy far more grossly than our own government has done, or, I should say, that any British Conservative government would dare to do. The clumsy, ineffectual chasing of the People's Convention is not the act of fascists. It is the act of stupid plutocrats who would rather like to introduce totalitarian methods, but do not know how. Of course, we have to be on our guard against these people, and to leave them out when the opportunity arises, but less because they are likely to consolidate their own power than because they will lose the war for us if they are left in control. When the opportunity for a shift in power will arise, I do not know. It does not exist at this moment. I think it existed after Dunkirk. And at this particular moment, I do not see what one can do, politically, except to spread as widely as possible the following 3 ideas. 1. Human progress may be held up for centuries unless we can eliminate Hitler, which means that Britain must win the war. 2. The war cannot be won unless the first steps towards socialism are taken. 3. No revolution in England has a chance of success unless it takes account of England's past. But what our new utopia, as Mr. Eade calls it, will be like in its first stage, we cannot tell. We do not know how it will be reached, whether fairly easily and by the willing act of the majority of the people, or slowly and painfully, through dictatorship and civil war. I have merely given reasons for thinking that revolution in England might be less bloody and disappointing than elsewhere. There is no certainty that the first phase of socialism will be better, from a hedonistic point of view, than democratic capitalism. But we cannot take account of that, because we can only consider the possibilities that exist. The one certain thing about this war is that we shall not end up where we began. To say that since capitalist democracy has its points, it would be better to retain it in toto, is as though a baby should say that since lying in its cradle is a very pleasant thing, it would be better to remain a baby all your life. No such thing can happen, and to wish for the impossible, even the impossible good, is inherently reactionary.